First of all, if we go back to Russia's involvement in Afghanistan, the thing that pushed Russia to leave Afghanistan was the mothers of the soldiers, because there were so many body bags coming back. It was less than 50,000. It was significantly less than the casualties that are coming back today. So that level of pressure hasn't built up yet. That's an indication of the level of control that Vladimir Putin's got over the information operation domestically, and his ability to influence the Russian thinking in that this is an existential conflict against NATO, protecting Russia and Russia's very existence. That can only last for a certain period of time. But then looking at more practical issues, you highlighted it there in that we're getting more migrants coming in, we're getting more overseas troops coming in. We've got Vladimir Putin and his Wagner group recruiting in Africa and getting African troops in. We've seen the deal that he's done with North Korea to get North Korean troops in. The African troops are very, very poorly trained, if at all. The North Korean troops are highly trained, but have got zero combat experience whatsoever and work in a very serialized environment. But if he's having to turn to places like that to get manpower, to get him some form of experience, that suggests that he's in real difficulties. He can get as many other individuals, give them a couple of weeks or a couple of days training on how to use an AK-47 or different variants of it and shove them into the front line, and they will just be decimated, as they are being at the moment. It is a meat grinder, and that is something that is relentless to the Ukrainians, because they can see the attacks coming in and they can see that they're killing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of human beings on a daily basis, and that will have a toll on the Ukrainians, and it's costing them as well. But nowhere near to the same sort of numbers. But we're in that attritional warfare phase at the moment, where the Ukrainians are trying to hold the Russians back until they can build up their capability that's been promised by the West for so long, and then start to have a greater effect on the front line, as well as elsewhere. They're making some small advances. They're capturing elements of territory. They've got the Ukrainian military under quite severe pressure across large parts of the front line. And therefore, if anyone was examining it, they would say that they're having some successes. But it's coming at huge cost. It's costing them over 1,000 troops a day. In the past 24 hours, the Russians have lost over 1,300 troops. They've lost over 28 artillery systems. They've lost over 12 tanks. And they're losing those sorts of numbers on a daily basis. And that is, frankly, unsustainable. No matter how big your military force is, no matter how capable it is, you're losing little bits of experience, what experience they've got left every time they lose these troops. And the equipment they're losing is the stuff that's working. The stuff that they're not putting forward is the stuff that's not working or is not up to the same sort of grade. So overall, from a tactical perspective, I think the Russians are under pressure, even though they're advancing. From an operational level and a strategic level, they're losing, and they're losing heavily.
How effective would you say Ukrainian long-range missile and drone strikes against strategic targets inside Russia have been?
I think they've been very successful, and they're getting increasingly successful. This is putting real pressure on to Vladimir Putin. Effectively, that if you include the maritime drones, have effectively decimated the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Ukraine is a country without a navy anymore. That is strategically significant. We're seeing the attacks on the oil refineries. That is impacting Russia economically. And we're starting to hear the first whispers of rationing going on and the petrol pumps across Russia. That will have an impact and bring this much more into the public domain. We're seeing more success on drones attacking Russian airfields at extremely long distances, up to 1,000 kilometers away from the Ukrainian front line. And whether it's one drone gets through and explodes, whether it has a military effect or not, that doesn't matter. It's having a psychological effect at a political level. And that's something that is forcing Vladimir Putin to wake up to, and having to spread the reducing number of air defense assets that he's got over a much wider area, and then to push those aircraft and other capabilities that are having an effect by firing missiles at Ukraine much further back to try and protect them. Again, that is limiting what he can do with them. And the Ukrainians are showing increasingly, and they're using increasingly domestically produced drones and other capability, they're showing increasingly that they can have an effect on that. That's only going to get better for the Ukrainians and worse for the Russians.
You touched on the Russian Navy there and the way the Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed in large part. What do you make of Vladimir Putin launching Russian naval drills in the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific, also in the Caspian Sea and the Baltic as well, reportedly involving most of the Russian fleet?
Well, it'll involve most of the Russian fleet that's working. There's vast parts of the Russian fleet that don't work. Their only aircraft carrier, which caught fire in dry dock, is unlikely to actually hit the high seas again. It's not scheduled to be out, I think, until 2026 or later. And therefore, what Vladimir Putin is still trying to do is to push out to those that are Russia's supporters across the world to try and suggest that Russia is still a global power. And in many ways, it is still a global power. It can produce naval forces in the Atlantic, in the Pacific. The Black Sea is where it can't, but it can still produce naval forces in the Mediterranean. So it has got that global influence. And we have to remember that Russia is a key part of the BRICS community. And showing that global power to them is important. They're showing off to China to say, look, we are still this global power. Come and support us. We can work together. And we're seeing the joint exercises between Russia and China, and interesting Belarus and China. But take Belarus and read that as Russia and Russian influence. But it's trying to bring China closer on board. This is all Vladimir Putin trying to suggest that he's in a much stronger position than he is in reality.
I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, Russia is said to have the world's third biggest navy. And yet, as you describe, the Black Sea Fleet has been, largely destroyed, or certainly partly destroyed, by a country essentially without a navy.
Yeah.
How has that been allowed to happen? How has Russia allowed the Black Sea Fleet to be degraded to such an extent?
Well, you can expand that to how is Russia, with the third largest army in the world, allowed a country with a very small army to hold it back and not let it achieve its operational objectives. I think it's down to the way that the Russian military have trained in the past, and the way the Russian military has been sustained in the past. If we look at it from a sustainment perspective, first of all, a lot of the repairs that should have been done to Russian equipment, and naval vessels are very complicated, haven't been done. But those individuals, admirals and others responsible for it, have taken the cash for that. Corruption has been rife in the logistics support across the Russian military, their army, but also into their navy and into their air force, which is why we're not seeing decisive action by the Russian air force. And then when it comes to training, the Russians are very good at putting little displays on and going out and sail a little group of ships up and down to do a few things. But a lot of their training regimes are scripted. So whenever the senior officer is there visiting, whenever the senior politician is there observing it, they have got set serials, between X time and Y time, 3 ships will steam in that direction, do a hard left turn and fire 3 missiles. And that's what they do. But that doesn't put it into the context of warfare, and it doesn't put it into the context of what the Ukrainians are exhibiting against them, irregular warfare or special operations executive type warfare. And the Russians had never prepared for sea drone attacks or anything else. They thought themselves invincible because of their might and because of their, in inverted commas, reputation. They had over-egged their own capabilities, and the Ukrainians knew that. They've trained closely with the Russians beforehand. Many of the Ukrainian officers have been to Russian Staff College and elsewhere. They are, some of them, family friends and connections with Russian officers. They know the psyche, but they also know the Western psyche. And the Ukrainians have been very clever and been able to combine the two together, look at the vulnerabilities and exploit those vulnerabilities.
Let's talk about the F-16 fighter jets. The mood music is that their arrival in Ukraine is imminent. Is it your sense, Philip, that the first we will know of them will be when they have carried out an attack?
I suspect that they're already the first ones. the Ukrainians will be training with them quite hard, trying to keep them protected. They will carry out one or two small operations with them just to give the pilots confidence in the airframe, the weapon systems, and everything else. The United States, I understand, have agreed to give the sophisticated weapons that are needed to turn the F-16 into the powerful platform that it is. But again, we're hearing, and this is only open source, that the Ukrainians have only got half a dozen of them. It's going to be a while before they get the mass that they need to have that effect. So what the Ukrainians will be looking at doing is trying to find an opportunity to use them in an ambush situation to send a clear message to the Russians that, hey, they've arrived and we've got you and we've got the weapons, because that will have that psychological effect on the Russians' ability to protect their front line with their air forces and want to push their air forces even further back. It'll also put the Russian air defense systems onto a much higher level of alert. And that's not good for Russian pilots. I think Russian air defense has shot down almost as many Russian pilots as Ukrainian air defense has done as well, because, again, lack of training, lack of proper drills, lack of command and control. They see a target, they fire first and ask questions later.
I mean, the F-16s have been described sometimes as a game changer, but are you saying that, if they do only have a handful of them, and given the issues with training, that's probably overhyped for the time being at least?
In the early days, it's overhyped. They need to be able to create a mass. They need to be able to create a mass to provide at least local air superiority over an area of the battlefield where the Ukrainians want to have an effect on the ground and concentrate their armored forces and punch through the Russians. Until they get the masses to be able to do that, and that means being able to have almost a 24/7 close air support capability, and then a combat capability above that to keep the Russian Air Force back. That takes time, that takes mass, that takes training. So it's not something that I think is going to be here during this year, during 2024. It's something that the Ukrainians will be working up to in 2025. But the Ukrainians will also want to have pre-operations to destroy as many of the Russian Air Force as possible. So they'll try and force them out. And when they're confident that they can use the F-16s from as much of a standoff range as possible, and they've got the weapon system, the missiles, the intelligence feeds, and everything else to have that effect on the Russian air forces and destroy as many as possible in the air. That'll push the Russians even further back. They need to do that before they even contemplate supporting ground operations. So we've got a long way to go yet before we'll see the proper effect from the F-16s. And it takes the numbers, it takes the pilots trained. It takes the pilots trained not just in flying the aircraft. This is where people get really mixed up with it. Yes, you could probably put an experienced fast jet pilot into an F-16 and he can take it off and he can land it again if you're lucky. And he or she is lucky, but you can't fight it. And if you can't fight it, you'll die. It's too complicated.
Russian losses are sustainable until they're not. And we've seen this week how President Putin has issued a decree increasing the financial incentives for signing a military contract. It's clearly an issue that they're very aware of. In terms of the political risks for him, does that extend to if he has to call up younger middle-class men from the big cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow? Because at the moment, a lot of the people fighting on the front line are convicts, or they're even migrants. They haven't received much training. If he has to call up people from the big cities, is that where the political risk comes for him?
Well, let's firstly look at the numbers. So the MOD assessment, intelligence assessment, was that the Russians were on average losing 1,263 troops a day in May, and that in June they were losing 1,263 troops a day. And on the last 2 days of July, the Ukrainian intelligence indicated that on the 30th of July, that Russia lost 1,060 troops, and on the 31st of July, they lost 1,370 troops. That is a burn rate which is unsustainable. So in terms of the risks, first risk, which you've mentioned, is that to try and get voluntary manpower, Putin yesterday signed this decree giving people 400,000 rubles, which is something like $4,600, which could be supplemented by up to 1.9 million rubles by the regional areas. So that was the first thing he did. The second thing he did was the Duma overturned a rule which had exempted those who had 3 children from military service, and they also ceased the exemption for those who had a disabled child from military service. So the pot, they're trying to increase the pot. Now, it'll come to a point when, if they do have to mobilize, that does come to the point when the societal contract between the Russian leadership and the Russian people has been technically broken. Now, of course, they did mobilize to stabilize the front in September 22. And it's not just that that aspect of it. It is the point that the Russian economy might also be beginning to overheat. We've seen this with the Central Bank of Russia in particular. And the 3 things which were in Russia's favor to begin with at the start of the war, because of course they didn't think it would be a long war, were firstly stockpiles of Soviet-era equipment. They're not denuded to the point of exhaustion, but they're being burnt through at a severe rate. Secondly, the fact that they could take poor and unemployed people, and now, because of the war economy, there is a shortage of labour. And thirdly, they had solid finances, which are also being broken into because of the way that the liberalised economy, which came after the Soviet Union, has now been reversed into a sort of Soviet-era Putinomics. All those things mean that we're back to the Clausewitzian triangle, that either the people get fed up, the elites get fed up, or there's a revolt in the army. Now, I don't think we're going to see any of those in the next month or 2 months, but there are pressures there for Putin, which he has to manage at the political level. It's also worth saying, of course, that the most recent polling from Russia, from Levada, which is about the most credible you can get in Russia, was, again, very contradictory in what it says. 58% of people favoured peace negotiations, but that really was invalidated by the fact that 75% were against returning any of the territories which they've illegally annexed, the 4 oblasts. And at the same time, 77 people support the special military operation and feel pride for what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So until that alters significantly, and it's often difficult to alter that significantly because you've got an informational autocracy in Russia, it can only alter by the conditions in Russia. So if taxes are rising, or they don't have access to things, and more families are affected, that's when you start getting potentially internal revolts. I don't see it at the moment, but it's one to look out for in the future. So the scale of all these offensives is going nowhere fast. Now, if we look at this in particularly towards what seems to be the ultimate objective there, or interim objective in Donetsk, which is Pokrovsk, the first major objective they see on the way to that is a place called Seleudo. Now, that is 10 kilometers from the line of contact at the moment. It is another 21 kilometers beyond that to Pokrovsk. That's 32 kilometers, give or take, 20 miles. They've never achieved any of that sort of operational tempo, movement and capture for a long, long time. So the notion of a breakthrough is not credible. The notion of gains, incremental slow gains, is probably credible. And that's why we're seeing most of the engagements along that sort of line of axis, northwest of the sector of Avdiivka, involving Chasiv Yar, Krasnorovka, and that's really the line where most of the operation is. The point of the salient at the moment is at a place called Ochoretina. We'll see what develops from that. But I was last speaking to you, James, 6 weeks ago, and really the change from 6 weeks ago to now is micro. So these are micro gains. This is glacial progress. And you've got to ask yourself why that is. The first reason is that this is a very transparent battlefield. The days when you can hide and do these big maneuvers are gone. The transparency of this battlefield means that you can be seen with first-person drones, and the unmanned aerial systems mean that you can be hit. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we're now seeing more of an equalization of the battlefield, particularly in the ammunition coming to Ukraine forces, and somewhat so in the manpower stakes as well. They haven't quite got over the problem yet of the glide bombs, but things are beginning to equalize for for the Ukrainians on the Donetsk side. So preserving the people of Ukraine is more important than preserving a piece of ground. So not that they're giving ground up willingly, but none of this is of operational significance at the moment.
Of course, one of the big developments this week is the arrival of the F-16s. According to US officials, that the first delivery has now been sent to Ukraine. We'll wait and see how they are deployed. We've spoken a lot about them on Frontline this week, and the general consensus from our experts seems to be, and I wonder whether you agree with this, that yes, they will have an impact, but because of the numbers that Ukraine has, or more to the point, the numbers that they don't have, it won't be a game changer. Is that your assessment?
Yeah, I think so at the moment. That would be true. Then we had the first announcement really at the Washington summit on the 10th of July that the Netherlands and Denmark and Biden put out a missive on the 10th of July saying that the process of giving the F-16s to Ukraine had started. Now, in military doctrine terms, again, we would always say clout, don't dribble. And at the moment, the process of transference is dribbling. It is not clouting. Now, we know that offers have been made for 85 F-16s at the moment, mainly from Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, and Belgium. And indeed, in the last few weeks, that's been increased because the Greeks are going to give 32 F-16s to America to give back to Ukraine when they get some F-35s. But that will give them somewhere of the region of ultimately 120, 130, which is the number which Zelensky said that they do need to take on the Russian Air Force or combat the Russian Air Force. But, they're not coming in enough numbers and quickly enough to be a game changer. I think the first role for those that will be there are to intercept the Russian missiles and drones, and the second one to target enemy air defense systems. They've not got the capability at the moment in terms of the land forces of Ukraine to be used in a offensive role to support the ground forces. So it's a multi-role fighter, but I see them being used to intercept the Russian missiles and drones as their first priority. Not a game changer. Nice that they're there. We know that it's going to be a long-term program. So, for example, the French are training 26 pilots between 2024 and 2026. And in a sense, for Ukraine and for Russia, you win if you don't lose. And you can see that from both sides. In the Ukrainian side, they need this sort of active defense, patience and avoidance probably of major offensives, because there are other things afoot which could destroy the capability and the will to fight of the Russians. But at the same time, we've also had this week someone like Medvedev, who's always been the rhetoric master in chief, really, for Putin, saying that they will take Ukraine by 2034. Now, you can interpret that in two ways. Firstly, that they're settling in for a long war and trying to make sure that the people know that. And secondly, that they're making the point again that Ukraine is an artificial state from their perspective, whose sovereignty they don't respect and indeed see it being incorporated into a greater Russia.
The ground-based air defense threat and the Russian fighter threat are such that it's very unlikely Ukraine will be able to loiter with F-16s at medium level as it would need to do to kind of employ those close air support tactics we think of from Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. So more standoff attacks with glide munitions, potentially adapting them as a launch platform for long-range cruise missiles, as the Sukhoi 24s have been being used for Storm Shadow and Scalp up to now, so UK, French cruise missiles. But that's against fixed targets. Suppression of enemy air defenses is a key task, so SEAD. It will be difficult for Ukraine, I think, to do more than SEAD with the F-16s. Normally for the US Air Force or NATO force, with the US Air Force doing the majority of this, you would do SEAD and DEAD, so suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses. You need the SEAD bit to do the DEAD bit, but SEAD only is mainly aimed at suppressing air defenses for a short period of time in a given area. And things like HARM are designed for that role. But it's difficult to ensure hits with HARM. There were some hits at the beginning when they started being introduced because Russian SAM operators, surface-to-air missile operators, took quite a while to recognize the threat was in country and adapt their tactics. But for aware ground-based air defenses, which the Russians certainly are, they've had a lot of experience against harm at this point. They will detect the launch and they will essentially turn off their radar and start moving. So the SAM systems are typically mobile. So because of the way a harm works, it's homing in on the radar signals from a hostile surface-to-air missile radar. Once that radar is off, it can only really fly to the point at which it thought that radar was. Now, with F-16, you'll potentially be able to use some of the more advanced modes to give it a better idea, using some of the sensors on the aircraft of exactly where, or from pre-planned knowledge of where the aircraft, of where the system was, to tell the missile more about where to go, not just from that radar signal. But even so, it's not a huge warhead. Most of these Russian SAMs are armored, at least against shell splinters. So you do generally need a pretty close to direct hit to cause serious damage. So harm remains a largely suppressive weapon. What the US designed it for with F-16 for SEAD back in the 90s and the 2000s was you would have a large mixed formations, some electronic attack support, so degrading enemy radar performance with electronic warfare. You would have formations firing lots of harm as they got closer and closer to force those SAM systems to either turn off and move, in which case we'll pack up. And back then, a lot of SAM systems didn't move. At least they weren't truly mobile. So you would be suppressing them as you came in, closing the distance, and then having located it and suppressed it with harm, you would have other aircraft in the formation or another formation come in and drop, usually cluster bombs, on the site. Clearly, for the Russian defenses these days, that's not really viable. Firstly, because the defenses are much more capable, they're much longer ranged, there's many more layers, and they move. But also because Ukraine will simply not be operating the numbers of aircraft, and the aircrew won't have had time to learn particularly to plan and lead formations with those kind of complex tactics. So SEAD, yes. Destruction of air defenses, probably not a huge amount. But the Ukrainians will probably find ways of working, as they have already, with things like HIMARS and ATACMS and Storm Shadow, of working to integrate the effects of harm launches to enable other things to get through and at least strike valuable targets that are being protected by air defenses, and in some cases, strike the air defenses themselves. So there's absolutely ways to go about degrading Russian kit with F-16, but it will be incremental improvements on a relatively small scale to start with. The initial transfers are likely to be of quite small numbers of F-16s, because even just for relatively small numbers, a squadron's worth maybe, you're looking at having to prepare a lot of and maintain quite a lot of locations to a really high standard to make it so that it's not really easy for the Russians to just work out exactly where they're going to be by looking at, which runways have been, had all the cracks filled in and or potentially extended, which, where are the unusual patterns of activity, and therefore concentrating orbital and potentially UAV and human intelligence assets to watching them. You'll need a lot of locations. And then even then, they'll probably need a degree of ground-based air defense at the sites as well, to shoot down one-way attack UAVs, cruise missiles, and potentially even ballistic missiles. And of course, it's a bit of a paradox, because one of the reasons why Ukraine desperately wants F-16 in country as soon as possible is to bolster its overstretched ground-based air defenses that are really struggling in terms of coverage and ammunition stocks. But at the same time, bringing F-16s into country will generate a significant additional draw on those limited, overstretched ground-based air defenses, because you'll need to defend them on the ground. But that's not a substitute for dispersal, because any air defenses can be saturated, and the Russians have got very good at saturating them. The key is to provide enough coverage that the Russians have to dedicate quite a significant salvo with quite a bit of planning behind it to have, for example, Shaheds and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles arrive at pretty much the same time from different angles. that takes some planning. And so if you have a bit of ground-based air defense, it kind of raises the thresholds of munitions use, and therefore planning complexity, and therefore time that it takes the Russians to go from detecting that they're at a base to actually striking them, which helps with your dispersal.
It's an old-fashioned technique, but will the Ukrainians be using decoys?
Absolutely, they'll be using decoys. Both sides make extensive use of decoys and have done throughout the war. It's actually one area where not just Ukraine, but actually Russia itself was way ahead of most Western militaries, even before this war, was in the large-scale production and use of very realistic decoys. They're not just kind of inflatable things. In the Russian case, at least, and the Ukrainian case, it would be fair to suggest they probably do as well. Some of them have, electronics and emitters within them to mimic some of the signals that you would expect certain assets that you're decoying to release, so that they not only appear convincing from visual or potentially infrared inspection, so you have to make them have a heat signature, but also from other forms of observation.
Am I right in saying that in recent months Ukraine has had success targeting Russian fighter jets in air bases as well?
Ukraine has had some successes over the past month or a couple of months in targeting Russian bases, targeting the Russian Air Force. They've destroyed some aircraft. There've been a number of successful strikes with, for example, ATACMS on bases in Crimea with submunitions, so cluster munitions. One issue with striking air bases is if you don't have real-time sort of target spotting, so a UAV or a special forces team nearby, or a very, very low latency orbital look, then just knowing there are aircraft on a base and being able to see it on satellite imagery doesn't necessarily tell you where the aircraft are on that base. And so given that most of an airbase is grass and concrete, you can get a fair degree of defense just by dispersal within the base and moving things around as to where you park them and service them fairly regularly, and having blast walls between aircraft. Early on in the war, Russia was very sloppy about the way that it deployed, serviced, turned around aircraft. So in early attacks, some of the first attacks on for example, major air bases in Crimea, you saw a significant number of Russian aircraft destroyed thanks to primarily secondary explosions from whatever was used to hit the base. So things like parking aircraft next to each other and refueling them at the same time as you're rearming them, so that if something gets hit, there's a lot of fuel and weaponry just kind of around aircraft, without blast walls between them necessarily, and having storage for munitions and fuel interspersed along the lines of aircraft. I mean, that kind of really sloppy fieldcraft, for want of a better word. Unfortunately, they have learned a bit. They're still not great, but the Ukrainians have managed to hit some of them. The key thing, I think, is that there is a clear strategy at play to try and force Russian aviation to either require a disproportionate amount of ground-based missile defense, so S-400s, SA-15 Tors, SA-17 Buks, Pantsir, SA-22. In other words, either force them to pull ultimately finite layered air defenses away from other bits of the front line, other potential targets, and concentrate them at air bases relatively near Ukraine, in which case those air bases will probably be pretty difficult to destroy aircraft on, but you'll have denuded a lot of other bits of the front line of parts of coverage, air defense coverage, and therefore Ukraine will have an easier time getting HIMARS strikes and potentially using aircraft near those parts of the front line. Or alternatively, if the Russians choose not to respond to the strikes in that way, they may then have to just stop using those air bases regularly and use air bases that are significantly further away from Ukraine. And that will have an effect in terms of reducing the practical strike rate that the Russian Air Force can conduct. So one of the key problems for Ukraine at the moment is glide bomb attacks from Russian fighter and fighter bomber aircraft. It's generally very difficult to shoot them down, and it's not sustainable to shoot down the bombs themselves. You'd run out of air defense ammunition almost immediately if you tried, because they're used in such numbers. But one of the ways that you can reduce that threat is by attacking Russian air bases and trying to therefore either pull air defences off elsewhere, in which case at least you have some benefit, or force them to operate further back, from much further back, in which case they're going much further each way on each sortie. So each aircraft, each aircrew can actually drop fewer bombs in a given number of time, and you'll increase the wear and tear. So it will functionally reduce the strike rate even without destroying aircraft. And Ukraine has shown an ability to conduct harassing attacks on air bases really quite a long way from Ukraine. So, you know, it's clear there's a strategy there, but that strategy is being undermined by the continued prohibition from most Western partners on using long-range Western systems like ATACMS, Storm Shadow, to strike Russian air bases near Ukraine in Russia itself, which is why you've seen most of these attacks being on Russian air bases in occupied Crimea, which we do not recognize as being Russia, because it was illegally annexed. So one of the key things that the West could do quickly to really help the glide bomb situation and give those F-16s more freedom of action potentially over time is to release those permissions holds and allow attacks on Russian air bases in Belgorod and Rostov and other parts of Russia, which have air bases which are regularly used for intensive strikes against Ukraine. That would impose more dilemmas on the Russians.
When we understand the casualties that Russians are suffering here, I mean, it's just, I mean, you know, it sounds very trite to say an industrial scale, but there was a report out of the UK Ministry of Defence Intelligence Update a few weeks ago saying that the Russians were losing over 1,000 people a day and they'd lost 70,000 in the last 60 days. I mean, that, you know, that is just unimaginable. And overall, they've lost 600,000 soldiers, which, you know, for a population the size of Russia is not sustainable. A whole host of things. And what we're seeing is because they are having to rush conscripts to the front, and again, relying on mainly ethnic Russians from the east and prisoners. I mean, I shouldn't think there's virtually a prison in Russia with any people in it because they're all at the front. I mean, the ones who are in prison are generally prisoners who've been to the front, done their year or 6 months, got off, committed another crime, gone back to prison, and then back out to the front. I mean, you just couldn't make it up. It's quite unbelievable. But mainly their conscripts are untrained. And with untrained conscripts, all they can virtually do is hold a rifle and fire. So they can't really, I don't think there's any danger that there's going to be a serious breakthrough with a great combination of armor and artillery. We did see last week one of the biggest Russian offensives down in the south, which, I think it was about 11 tanks and 40 other armored vehicles, you know, which sounds big, but on the bigger scheme of things, it's pretty small. But that was disrupted. So I say transition. So things are relatively static. Now, there is a lot of hope that Ukraine can get on the offensive. And there are a number of positives, I think, here. I mean, first of all, the Ukraine maritime, and I don't call it navy because they haven't really got a navy, have defeated the Great Black Sea Fleet. The significance of this is that Ukraine now has freedom of maneuver in the Black Sea. And that is hugely significant because I think, and I'm not alone in suggesting that Crimea is a real possibility that, you know, quite apart from, you know, forget about the Donbass and the areas east in Ukraine, Ukraine could possibly retake Crimea because the Black Sea Fleet's not there to protect it. We've seen over the last few months and particularly last few weeks the amount of attacks going into the Crimea to take out airfields where some of their key weaponry is and take out their air defense, taking a heck of a battering. Only last week we heard that Putin is redirecting air defense units to protect his own palaces in Moscow and Sochi, which is remarkable. So that is significant. We've talked about the permission that Ukraine has to use weaponry outside Ukraine's territory into Russia. And what the news this week is that the much vaunted, much talked about F-16s are There are rumours that there are some in Ukraine already, but about to arrive, and this is really vexing the Russians. Now, whether there are going to be enough F-16s to have a difference, and the key thing with the F-16s is about air power. Now, one of the main reasons that the Ukrainians have not been able to progress is that Russia has controlled the skies. And if you control the skies, you do not have freedom of maneuver on the ground. So you're very vulnerable to that. Now, in the last few months, that control of the air has been on the move. So we've had air parity. Russia no longer has freedom of maneuver in the skies. And if it loses, and if Ukraine gets air superiority, then we're in a very, very different situation. And there's not a lot the Russians can do about it, because going back to training, whether you're training tank crews or whether you're training individuals to fight in a trench, it still takes time. When I was commanding officer of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment, it took us over a year to train to then go and do the sort of operations that tank regiments are supposed to do. Now, Russia is doing this in days, so quite not surprisingly. And when it comes to aircraft, of course, Russia doesn't have an inexhaustible supply of aircraft, and Ukraine is just one area for them. They've also got the rest of NATO that they think they need to defend against, and they've got a vast country to protect. So, yeah, I think the balance should, let's hope it does, start moving towards Ukraine with all these various things happening. And I think the other thing that is really galvanizing people is the US election, because both Trump and his running mate Vance have indicated that they are likely to, maybe they might not stop aid completely, but significantly, and whether the rest of Europe and the other NATO countries can pick up the slack of this $60 billion or so that America's spending annually is very questionable. So there is a desire to try and make a significant move before that happens.
I want to come back to the F-16s in a moment, but I was really struck by what you said there, Hamish, about Putin transferring air defences to protect his palaces in Moscow and Sochi. And, it's fascinating how we talk so much about military tactics and military logistics, but actually, human emotion and psychology comes into this so much, particularly when you're dealing with a character like Vladimir Putin, who is paralysed, it seems, by paranoia.
Entirely. I mean, I think that whole piece is actually a brilliant bit of subterfuge by the Ukrainians, because I think it was in April that they had said that they had flown a number of drones that attacked all refineries north of Moscow and flew them over Putin's palace in Moscow. And that seems to have perpetuated this desire to rearrange their air defense systems. And the Russian MOD said basically we've reviewed where our air defense is and we're moving it to high value targets. So if you're a young Russian at the front and you see your anti-aircraft cover moving back to protect Putin in one of his luxury palaces, I would have thought your morale takes a bit of a hammering. But it absolutely does show that. I mean, but Putin is a classic Russian tyrannical leader. None of them end well, and like a lot of tyrants, they are more concerned about their own well-being than the people they purport to lead and direct, as it were. So I think it is very, very telling that is happening. And of course, protecting his luxury villas in Sochi and his palaces all around the place, when he's got limited assets, is actually making the chance of it progressing in Ukraine that much less. So great. Let's hope he continues to do it.
Just to go back to the F-16s, the sense is that their arrival is pretty imminent, or their deployment is pretty imminent. They may indeed be in Ukraine already. How do the Ukrainians protect them? Because, the Russians will be trying to spot them and target them and launch airstrikes against them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And a lot of the Russian telegram channels are talking about the F-16s, saying that they know where they're going to be. There was a report of an airfield in Ukraine being hit the other day, and the Russians claiming they'd destroyed some F-16s. The Ukrainians said that they were mock-up F-16s. I think, this is a war of propaganda and disinformation. So, intuitively, one believes the Western view, the Russian view. There is so much rubbish that comes out of it that one just doesn't believe anything they say. In fact, usually the truth is 180 degrees from what they're saying. But it's a great point how you protect them and where they come from. It's going to be a challenge. They're going to have to be very agile. I expect moved a hell of a lot. No doubt there'll be a lot of sophisticated electronic warfare being used, no doubt supported by US and British and French and other assets that can do this. And they will be used for high value targets, no doubt. But again, I think, I said earlier, I think that the Ukrainians are very canny, and no doubt it's a sort of double-edged weapon. If the Russians are so focused on tracking down these F-16s, then it gives opportunities elsewhere. We've seen Putin wants to put all his air defense assets to protect himself. And no doubt he's told the Russian high command, take out those F-16s. Well, while they're putting so much focus on them, the Ukrainian organic fighter jets could be, creating merry hell elsewhere. So, yeah, all of these things are not straightforward, but with every sort of downside, there's usually an opportunity that can be exploited as well. And the fact that the F-16 is such a big deal, the fact that the Russians are so excited about it, if I was a Ukrainian commander, I'd be licking my lips and thinking, right, this is something we can really use to try and, do something else, as it were. And, I'm sure that if an F-16 comes up against an ancient Russian fighter, it will perform pretty well too. I mean, there's a lot. I know that Russian Telegram channels are saying that there are only 6 Ukrainian pilots trained to fly these things, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I haven't seen that. I wouldn't believe it. So I think the F-16 is a real turning point, not for itself, but because of what else it might enable.
A lot of this looks a bit like essentially what my colleague Jack Watling talked about fairly recently as the compounding advantages that Russia has, and that is it is still being able to use the larger number of people it's got on the front line and some of the advantages in firepower to very, very slowly grind its way forward. And that's mostly, it seems to be coming out of the Donbass and particularly the area around Donetsk. So the incursion in the north around Kharkiv, that looks like that has stalled and remained stalled for some time now. And indeed, the Ukrainians have sort of been able to push them back. And that hasn't created a buffer zone that the Russians wanted, and Russian artillery can't reach into the outskirts of Kharkiv. But because that was done at the cost of pulling reserves from elsewhere, we're seeing the Russians just being able to kind of very slowly move forward, or indeed, slightly worryingly for the Ukrainians, some of the recent reporting suggests they've picked up the pace of some of their territorial gains in the past couple of weeks.
Are we seeing any change in Russian tactics?
I mean, there's always a bit of a lag in terms of really understanding the detail of what's going on in tactics, and so much of it happens behind the scenes. Things like changing frequencies and the electronic warfare battle that goes on around the use of drones. But there doesn't seem to have been a radical change in Russian tactics. They're still taking horrendous casualties. There is a little bit of evidence of perhaps them being able to attack in slightly larger numbers, so at sort of battalion level, several hundred people at any one time. But they're still not conducting that kind of large coordinated offensive with thousands upon thousands of people attacking in coordinated fashion. But in truth, they don't need to make these kind of small incremental gains. What they are able to do is put pressure all the way along the front line and see where essentially the Ukrainians are thinnest. And that does seem to be, as I say, around Donetsk and a little bit also to the south around Zaporizhia.
As you say, they've been making small incremental gains on the front line. Some would say, given Ukraine's manpower issues and given the delay in Western military aid, it's surprising that Russia haven't been able to take more territory. What's your response to that?
So, first of all, for the majority of this phase of the war, so the past 2 years, it has turned out that defense is stronger than attack, and that's largely just because of the ability to see more of the battlefield, particularly as more and more surveillance drones and other capabilities have come into play, and to bring artillery to bear on prepared positions. So those kind of rapid thrusts that have taken place have actually been fairly unusual, and have largely taken place because of advantages temporarily in terms of either concentrations of forces or actually unfavourable conditions on the battlefield. So battlefield geometry, as it's called, essentially where are people positioned? Have they got their supplies and logistics in place? Are there vulnerabilities? Are they slightly cut off? So no, the Russians haven't managed to make a huge breakthrough, but it does look like they are improving their position around some of the higher ground places like Chasiv, which are key to then being able to threaten further back and deeper into Ukrainian lines and pose them questions about whether or not they are prepared to cede some ground, essentially pull back, which is potentially militarily necessary but is politically difficult.
How big an issue is supplies for Ukraine currently?
So, I mean, it's difficult to know in terms of the sort of the day-to-day. The broad picture is that the Western support, particularly the big package of US aid, is now coming into play. And we've seen that in terms of various parts of the front line where there was a very unequal artillery battle going on, that the Ukrainians have been able to narrow that gap, but not necessarily close it. I think the big problem at the moment, whilst there are some issues around, for example, how quickly air defences can get into country, and we should probably return to the question of the air side of the campaign, their real challenge is their ability to increase their mobilisation and get people, through recruiting, into formed units and onto the front line. And that's not just a 2024 problem. Their issue is, can they mobilise, train, and put together in large groups the people that they will need if they really want to make any kind of large counteroffensive next year.
That's really interesting because earlier this year, President Zelensky did change the age of conscription to 25. It had been 27. Even despite that, mobilisation remains a massive issue for Ukraine.
I think there's some suggestion that there are challenges meeting their recruitment targets, but even where they do begin to meet those, it's simply a question of time. It takes time to get those people through the system, and there's a if you like, there's a compromise there. There's a trade-off, which is that they could put people through more rapidly and get them onto the front line sooner, and that would enable them to either thicken literally those lines or pull tired, exhausted units, many of whom have been in contact for months now, off those lines to give them a chance to re-equip and refit. But that means you're putting people with much lower levels of training into the fight. One of the things that had to be pointed out kind of repeatedly in terms of what the UK large-scale training program was doing, Operation Interflex. So that's the training activity that takes place here in the UK with a range of international partners, is that was always only ever initial basic infantry training. That wasn't intended to create fully formed forces that could operate at a large scale, coordinated with others. Those people still had to go on into then the Ukrainian training system and do specialist training or additional training. So you can only accelerate that kind of training so much before you're compromising on quality, which might mean you take more casualties when the Ukrainians have generally been much more careful about husbanding their resources in comparison with the Russians.
I mean, that's a really good point. It's a pretty stark disparity between how Ukraine approaches this and how Russia does. Russia clearly deciding it's about numbers, and a lot of the troops actually fighting on the front line have received very little training, it would appear.
Yes, and What if you had to infer from that, if you like, kind of slight recklessness, what they were attempting to do, it's to make as much ground now whilst they still have those advantages in terms of numbers, materiel, and refurbished equipment, because they will have to do another bout potentially of mobilisation at the end of this year or next year. And there's no doubt that they have the people, but again, there's a Russian political cost to that. At some point, they will also have to start facing up to their own industrial capacity, which is switching from refurbishing old, albeit serviceable equipment, and begin increasing their manufacturing of new armoured vehicles, tanks, etc., to replace the losses that they're taking. What they've concentrated on up until now has been an awful lot of the air-launched weapons, sort of cruise missiles and precision strike weapons, because that is an area where they can really press home an advantage. But in due course, they're going to have to look at new artillery barrels, new artillery, both self-propelled and other types, and eventually new armoured vehicles.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to The Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.